But that says nothing about whether or not religion provides a sufficient explanation for why it's happening or justification for why it's happening. Because here's the problem. In order to assert that there is an all-loving God who is supervising this, and because, I'm not the one here who is claiming that this is being supervised, that somebody is watching this, somebody knows that this is occurring, and somebody's allowing it to occur. If we're going to assert that there is a benevolent being who is allowing this to occur, then it must follow that there is morally sufficient reason for this to occur. In the United Kingdom, just today, we passed 100,000 people who've been killed by the virus. And the Christian has to say that this is morally justified. I'm not sure exactly, well, I know what the reason would kind of look like, which is some form of sound, valid argument in favor of God's existence. If the ontological argument is sound, then the conclusion of the ontological argument is true. It's as simple as it gets. Now, I find this interesting because, it's actually fairly recently that this analytic style of philosophical thinking has been applied to religion, and traditional systematic theologians were, at least originally, quite hostile to the introduction of analytic philosophy to doing theology. And they say that the reason that this is because, religion requires narrative, it requires poetry, it requires this kind of faith-based thinking that analytic philosophy, reason alone can't really grasp at. This I find to be telling, right? We have someone coming along and saying, listen, I am going to accept what can be reasonably shown to be the case, and systematic theology essentially rejecting it on the basis of it not being able to properly handle the content of their beliefs. I find it incredibly telling that when we try to apply this kind of analytic style of thinking to theological thought, the response is never to try and show why actually we can provide an analysis which shows that this is in keeping with our reasonable logical thinking, but rather to say that actually the methodology is inappropriate to use in this case, and we should be using this vague concept of faith instead, which I still haven't heard precisely defined from Bishop Barron, which would be quite helpful actually if rather than kind of talking around the subject as I think we've been doing here. I think it would be helpful to the listener and to me if we could have a sentence perhaps that sums up what faith is as a dictionary theological definition.
Faith is a response to the revealing God.
Give us that again, Bishop Barron.
Faith is a response to the revealing God, the response of the whole self in the presence of the God who reveals himself. Now, that's not repugnant at all to what we were doing 20 minutes ago in talking rationally about God in terms of philosophical proofs. I think those are very effective ways to approach the mystery of God. But then there's the strange claim from the heart of religious traditions that God has spoken, which means God has revealed something of himself beyond what the mind on its own can grasp. Now, the mind can understand it. It can take it in, think about it. Faith-seeking understanding, etc. But to make it more specific, in the Christian context, we're talking about the incarnation, we're talking about the Trinity. Two realities that reason can't on its own grasp, but were given to us, were revealed to us. And faith is the response of the entire person to the revealing God.
Atheism doesn't claim to have any explanatory power, okay? What we can say is that we would expect if there is a world in which there are conscious creatures, which I recognize some people think is unlikely given atheism generally, but if that's our premise, what would we expect to find? Well, we'd have no reason not to expect there to be all kinds of unpredictable and seemingly arbitrary suffering. It's not me who has to do the explaining here, and you're right, Justin, that during a tragedy like this, you find that people come to religion and people go away from religion. But that falls within the realm, I think, of a psychological discussion. It's like people might come to God because they find it's a good way to deal with the immense tragedy of the suffering that we're facing. But that says nothing about whether or not religion provides a sufficient explanation for why it's happening or justification for why it's happening. Because here's the problem. In order to assert that there is an all-loving God who is supervising this, and because I'm not the one here who is claiming that this is being supervised, that somebody is watching this, somebody knows that this is occurring, and somebody's allowing it to occur. If we're going to assert that there is a benevolent being who is allowing this to occur, then it must follow that there is morally sufficient reason for this to occur. In the United Kingdom, just today, we passed 100,000 people who've been killed by the virus. And the Christian has to say that this is morally justified. And they're welcome to do so with reference to theodicies, by saying that, this is pain. People like to speak kind of abstractly about how pain and suffering might be necessary to obtain certain goods, or it'll be compensated in the afterlife, or something of this sort. But we have to say specifically on an issue like this, that yes, this specifically, 100,000 people who have died of COVID have done so because God allowed it. That's the first thing that needs to be admitted by the Christian, and most Christians have no problem accepting that. The difficulty comes in the second proposition, which is that it's justified. This needs to happen, or this should have happened, or at least there's no kind of moral qualm with this having been allowed to happen. That's the problem that needs to be faced.
And can I just, from you, Alex, just understand, is this a major reason why you don't believe in God, i.e. the problem of evil is for you a major objection to God?
Yeah, call it not an active cause of my atheism, but a sustaining cause. It wasn't the reason why I left the faith originally, but it's one of the reasons that prevents me from re-entertaining the idea. I mean, as we've discussed, there are plenty of seemingly plausible arguments to say that there's a necessary being at the bottom of contingent chains in the universe, that there's a being who sustains things, that there's an arbitrary first cause or something like this. But to say that this first cause is a loving God who will preside over the kind of suffering that we've seen, not just in the human context of something like the coronavirus, but also the hundreds of billions and trillions, if you include sea life, of animals who are going through suffering that we wouldn't even be capable of imagining, there seems to be no explanation for this.
When analytic philosophy applies reason to theology, it runs into a wall, not because reason fails, but because theology retreats. Alex is right. Faith gets used as a shield when arguments can't hold up. Systematic theologians themselves were historically hostile to logic-based inquiry because it exposed contradictions. And take suffering, not just human, but across evolution. Over 99% of all species have gone extinct. Billions of animals endure brutal lives, parasitism, starvation, disease, all before humans even existed. That's not just tragic, it's systematic and ongoing. A loving designer wouldn't build a world like this. The COVID pandemic is just one recent example. Over 7 million global deaths, and children weren't spared. Christians say it's part of some plan, but that's moral hand-waving. If a human allowed that kind of suffering knowingly, we'd call them monstrous. It's not enough to say God has a reason. If that reason can't be shown, it's indistinguishable from no reason at all.
Okay, so this is a huge question that we're trying to,
we're taking on the small questions today.
Yeah, where are you going to begin with this, Bishop Barron?
Well, how about with Aquinas? In the Summa, when he poses the question, "Utrum Deus sit," is there a God? And Aquinas famously puts up objections first, right? Well, two of them we've talked about. One is that nature is a self-contained system. There's no need to go outside of nature to explain what's going on within nature. That's objection one. Objection two, and Thomas states it, I think, more elegantly than anyone in the tradition, and I include the atheist tradition. Thomas said, if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. So if there were an infinite heat, there'd be no cold. That's his example. But God is called the infinite good. Therefore, there should be no evil if there's an infinite good. But there is evil. Therefore, there is no infinite good. That's a good argument. That's an elegantly stated argument. And it's what has been argued for millennia, right? It's the perennial objection. Now, I'm sure everyone here knows the classical response, rooted in people like Augustine, repeated by Aquinas, that God doesn't cause evil, but God is so good that he draws good out of evil that might not have existed without evil. He permits evil to bring about a greater good. Now, can we see that sometime? Sure. I mean, there's obvious examples in our ordinary experience of evils that actually produce a great good. Can we very often not see it? Well, yeah, of course. I'd say even typically we don't see right away, oh yeah, that's the reason why that was permitted. So do we hold as theists that God is providentially ordering the whole of the universe? That, as Jean-Pierre de Caussade put it, everything that is in some sense the will of God, either actively or permissively. Yeah, I think we are obliged to hold that view. Therefore, something like this formula has to obtain, that God permits forms of suffering to bring about a greater good. Now, can we see it? As I say, sometimes yes, typically no, but that shouldn't surprise us, right? If we're talking about not one contingent cause among many, so someone who might be ordering things in one corner of the universe, but of God, ipsum esse, the creator of all things, whose preserve is all of space and all of time, is it at all likely that we're going to see the full implications of whatever is happening, the full implications across space and time of what's being permitted? And the answer there is obviously no. And I think now go back to the book of Job is the classic biblical answer. In the presence of great evil, great suffering, is we don't know what God is up to. And we're in no position, now I'd put that back on Alex, we're in no position to say definitively there is no morally justifiable reason for this particular evil, because we need a godlike perspective on all of space and all of time in order to make that claim. And that's the import of God's speech to Job, the longest speech of God anywhere in the Bible. Where were you when I made the heavens and the earth, etc.? But it just means you're in no position to pronounce or to articulate that premise that you have clear knowledge. There can't be a morally justifiable reason for a given suffering. It seems to me that from a purely logical standpoint, the argument's not that compelling. It is filled with emotional power. I completely get it. Like anybody who's lived more than 2 years on planet Earth, I've suffered in my life and wondered why and asked the question. Of course I do. And then as Alex and many others point out, the really horrific suffering that we can see at all levels of a sentient being. Sure, I get it. I totally get the emotional power of that. But it seems to me from a strictly logical standpoint, it's not a compelling argument because it assumes you have a godlike perspective.
Bishop Barron argues that we can't judge whether suffering is morally justified because we don't have a God's eye view of space and time. But that's not a defense. It's a deflection. Imagine applying that logic to anything else. A government committing atrocities, a parent neglecting their child, or a doctor inflicting pain. If we excuse them by saying, well, maybe they had reasons beyond our understanding, we'd be erasing the entire foundation of moral accountability. Now consider the scale of suffering. Over 500 million years, evolution has progressed through mechanisms like predation, disease, and mass extinction. The fossil record shows no sign of moral oversight, just brutal, indifferent processes. Tapeworms, brain-eating parasites, childhood cancer. These aren't occasional exceptions. They're baked into nature's operating system. If God is responsible for that system, He didn't just permit suffering, He engineered it. That's not mysterious. It's incompatible with the idea of a loving, all-powerful being. And the greater good argument collapses under scrutiny. If you say a child's death from leukemia is justified because someone in the family became stronger or more compassionate, you're using that child's life as a tool, not valuing it as an end. That's called instrumentalizing suffering, and it's something we would reject in any human ethical system. Even the claim that we can't know if suffering is justified is flawed. If we can't know God's reasons, then we also can't claim God is good. You can't have it both ways. Either moral standards apply or they don't. But once you suspend them to protect God, you've emptied morality of meaning.
This, of course, is not. It doesn't need to be framed in a logical way. Of course, the logical problem of evil has been famously made by a number of atheists, but this can also just be seen as an inductive point, right? Because what's being said here, in many elegant words, I believe, is essentially, in the context of the coronavirus, which is how you originally brought this up, Justin, is the claim that it's worth it. We don't know what for, but it's worth it. 100,000 people have been killed by this virus, which, if it is the case that some good was necessitated by the death of these people, humanity seemed to have been getting on just fine for around 200,000 years before the coronavirus appeared on the scene. I don't see why now, all of a sudden, it's now necessary to bring in this new virus to produce some good that everybody else seemed to do without. And you have to turn around and say that the reason this is happening is because it's worth it. And someone asks you, well, what on earth for? What on earth is this worth it for? 100,000 people. Why couldn't it be 9,999? Why couldn't one person have been spared? Why couldn't one person's suffering have been marginally less? Surely the same kind of goods of community spirit or whatever it is that you think the good is that's come out of this coronavirus could have been achieved with one less person dying. And not only does God turn around and say, well, listen, you don't know what I know. Yeah, just wait and see. He turns around and says, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? How dare you even suggest that you know better than me? How dare you even ask the question? How dare you question that me allowing this to happen is a good thing, is worth it? And you have to look at your dying father in the eyes and say, I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to say that this is a tragedy, because I know that from a divine perspective, the only way to reconcile my Christianity is to say not just that this is some kind of tragedy with an explanation, but no, this is worth it, this is good, this brings about something better. I don't think that's a task that can be done.
Yeah, but who are you or I or anyone to say? How do we know? How would anyone, we'd have to have a godlike grasp of all of space and all of time to make a judgment, pro or con. Neither one of us, no one can make that judgment. And I mean, you can characterize it the way you did in a sort of flip manner, but that God permits evil to bring about some greater good, I don't know what that is. How do I know specifically what that is, though I can state the principle, I think, legitimately? But I don't know. How do I know? How does anybody know? I think it's arrogant on either side, in a way, to claim that knowledge.
Well, then,
I know that God exists on other terms. So, I mean, I think through various paths and various rational means, I know that God exists. I also know that evil is present in the world. So I've got to find a way to reconcile those. It seems to me the principle achieves that. The details of it, I don't know. How would I possibly know?
Well, perhaps I can elucidate the problem I have with this view by asking you a question. Bishop Barron, would you say, for instance, that it is bad when a woman has a miscarriage or a baby is ripped from the arms of its mother in a tsunami? Would you say this is a bad thing?
Sure.
Well, how could you possibly say that? How could you be so arrogant as to suggest that you know enough about the ultimate reasons for this happening that you can conclude that this is overall, all things considered, a bad thing? The problem is that if we say that because we don't have this divine universal perspective that allows us to understand the exact, complete kind of field of play that's going on here, I'm not allowed to say that actually there's no justification for this because I can't possibly know that, then we forfeit our right to use any kind of moral language because we are never, ever in a position to judge these things. And so we can never say that something is bad or something is good because we don't have that perspective.
No, I don't see why that would follow. I mean, I can say like a moral action is bad. I can say what Hitler did is bad. It's morally wrong. Now, did God permit that? Well, sure, in the measure that God permitted Hitler to come into being, that God didn't interfere with Hitler's activity. So God allowed that. God permitted it. But I can still say it's bad. But does God allow that evil to bring about some greater good that I can't see? That's the principle. But I have no hesitation calling things good or bad.
I mean, earlier on, you said as well, Alex, that you can't call the death of someone's father a tragedy if you're a Christian because it can't be a tragedy if God has some greater purpose in mind. But presumably, Bishop Barron, you would say tragedy exists for Christians, even if we do believe there's an ultimate,
well, again,
reason.
We're probably equivocating a bit. I mean, I would subscribe to Dante's. We're ultimately dealing with a divine comedy. So in that grandest possible sense, there's no tragedy. I'm dealing with a comedy, finally. But sure, within that, sure, from our perspective, we can identify something as tragic or deeply sad or wicked. But God's perspective, God is not one fussy competitive object among many. God's not one little fussy cause among many, but God is ipsum esse, more like the author of a novel than a character in it, right? And so Dostoevsky allowing all sorts of darkness within his great novels, but still having a commanding viewpoint. And it's an analogy that limps like all analogies, but God's more like that than one fussy character among many within the novel.
Well, yeah, I mean, when Dostoevsky allows a character to be mistreated, it's certainly good for the plot line, but it's not good for the character. And that's the point here. The Christian, at least the theodicy that's been proposed here, is one saying that, evil is allowed because some greater good can be brought brought from it, which means the corollary of this is that any time an evil exists, any time bad exists, it exists precisely because some good is going to be brought out of it. That is to say, evil is actually an indication that something good is happening, which means that all of these evil instances, and I specifically avoided using instances that have the complication of free will, so I wouldn't use something like the Holocaust, but I use something like the coronavirus or something like a miscarriage. The implication of this, the implication of saying that evil is always an indication that some good is being obtained, is to say that these are things worth celebrating. Any time that one of these things happens, any time that a tragedy, and of course you can see it as an emotional tragedy, a Christian is still perfectly entitled to say that they're upset by this, that they're sad, that they're angry, that they don't understand the reasons, but ultimately philosophically they have to say this is a cause for celebration. Thank goodness that this has been allowed to happen so that we can draw out some good. Thank goodness that this 100,000 people in the United Kingdom have been killed by this virus so that some good can be achieved.
That's an emotional appeal, though, Alex. I don't think that's right. I mean, the Christian would look gravely at the situation and acknowledge God's will is at work here, though I can't see it. I mean, I think that's the right attitude. To say I would celebrate it seems to me the wrong point of view. You'd look at it and acknowledge there's a dimension to this that I can't fully appreciate. I place it within the context of God's ultimate purposes, but I do so, I mean, obviously in a very grave manner, typically in the presence of great suffering. So I wouldn't say that, we can celebrate it, but
we can, of course, we can have grave celebrations, right? I mean, would you not say that God's will being done to produce good ends is worth celebrating? Of course, if God's will is being done to produce a good end, that's something worth celebrating. Now, in the same way, if we win a war, if we win World War II, we celebrate that happened, but it's a kind of solemn celebration because we recognize the cost that was paid. But it's still a celebration. It's still a good thing that we won that war. If evil is actually an indication of God's will being done by the procurement of some good through some evil, then as solemnly as that celebration may occur, it should have to be something worth celebrating, which seems to me totally anathema to the way that any person could, let alone should, entertain these kinds of tragedies.
Alex is exposing the core contradiction in Bishop Barron's worldview, that suffering is both tragic and good. The moment you say every evil exists because it brings about a greater good, you're forced to treat suffering as necessary, not just permitted, but required. This leads to a moral absurdity, that the Holocaust, COVID, or a child's death are, ultimately, good events. Not emotionally good, but metaphysically necessary. Let's take the coronavirus. In the US alone, over 1.1 million people have died. Globally, that number is over 7 million. Entire families were wiped out. Healthcare systems collapsed. Long COVID still affects millions. To say this was permitted for some unseen greater good is not just unfalsifiable. It's a claim with no moral accountability. It removes agency from suffering. It denies randomness, biology, and systemic failures. Theological arguments about greater good also fall apart when we look at natural evil, which has nothing to do with human free will. Miscarriages, for instance, are incredibly common, affecting around 10 to 20% of known pregnancies, and likely more when accounting for early losses. Most are due to chromosomal abnormalities. There is no character development, no soul-building purpose here. It's nature running on flawed mechanics. Is this God's design? If so, it's a design that builds life on a foundation of failure. Then there's the evolutionary evidence. Over hundreds of millions of years, life has advanced through brutal selection pressures, starvation, parasitism, predation, and extinction. Over 99% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct. If this system was created by a loving God, it means He chose to make a world where agony is the engine of progress. Even Christian theologians struggle with this. William Dembski, an intelligent design proponent, once suggested that God allowed the appearance of millions of years of suffering for theological reasons, essentially to maintain the illusion of natural history. That's how far one has to stretch logic to protect divine goodness. What Alex points out is simple. If every event is ultimately good, then good and evil lose meaning. We can't condemn genocide, famine, or disease because behind it all, we're told, is a divine hand weaving something beautiful. But that's not morality. That's moral surrender. And it's dangerous. When you strip suffering of its moral urgency, you become numb to injustice. And that's the heart of the problem. This framework doesn't ask us to act against suffering. It asks us to accept it, to trust it. But if we want a better world, we can't afford to excuse suffering as part of some higher plan. We have to name it, challenge it, and work to reduce it, not spiritualize it. So here's a serious question worth reflecting on. If your moral system turns every tragedy into a hidden good, how can it ever call anything truly wrong and mean it?
Alex, why are you an atheist then?
Well, beautifully put, as always, Trent. Although there are more than two things that amaze me when I look around the world, or capture my imagination, let's say. Of course, the stars at night are incredible. The moral feeling that every person intuitively has, except maybe a few eccentric examples of human beings who don't appear to have that within them. These are amazing, but what also captivates me in the nature of our human experience is the depth of suffering to which we're all capable of sinking. I think that suffering in many ways defines the human experience, and certainly the experience of non-humans, such that I know people who will go their entire life saying that they've never really experienced any real pleasure. Their whole life has been a misery. But you'll never find a person who says that their entire life they haven't had any real pain and suffering. This is something that equally needs to be accounted for. Now, to me, I said this in a conversation that I had with Trent and the others yesterday. The problem of evil, as it's famously formulated against the existence of a good God, is usually thought of as a response to religion, as a response to the existence of a God. You have this construct, you have this idea of an afterlife, and of ethics, and of a perfectly good being. And then you look around you at the immeasurable levels of suffering that we experience, the nihilism, the pointlessness, the pain. And we say this causes a problem, it's a response to it. But I think this is exactly the wrong way around. I think that the suffering came first, the nihilism came first, and that religion itself is a response to this. And so if you're wondering why it is that, of course, when you look at the nature of our human experience, why is it that we have this wonderful thing that seems to just explain it all away and give us a kind of comfort that we so desperately need? Well, maybe that's because it was how it was designed. The greatest accounts of nihilism and pain and suffering and of reaching out to God and finding no answer can be found in religious scripture. You can find in the book of Job the experience of a man who is suffering and doesn't know why. You can find in Ecclesiastes the lambastation at the meaninglessness of existence, the toiling and the toiling to no end, the fact that eventually all of our achievements will be given to somebody who is unworthy of them when we die and have to pass everything we have on to another person. And the book of Ecclesiastes ends with saying, this is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. That is, you have pages and pages and pages of nihilistic outcry. Somebody saying they just cannot understand why everything is so meaningless. They cannot live a meaningful life. They cannot find pleasure and joy in anything. And the conclusion of this is fear God and follow his commandments. It's kind of tacked on at the end there. The author of Ecclesiastes, the person who wrote it, is reporting the words of somebody else, Kohelet, who is the one who's the nihilist. And at the very end of this, the author adds on their own addendum where they say, therefore, fear God and keep his commandments. And what does this say to us? It says to us that maybe this is just a way to escape the suffering. Maybe we just all recognize that we've been dropped into this completely ununderstandable circus of pain and torment and confusion, and we have no idea what's going on. We have no idea where we got here, and it's terrifying. It's scary. And so we come up with a way to try to console ourselves in this situation. Now, if we look at how suffering is embedded into not just the human experience, as I say, but also the non-human experience, then we can ask a simple question. What would we expect to see if Christianity were true? What would we expect to see? How would we expect life to have evolved? What would we expect people's interactions to be like? And if we assumed atheism, again, if we assumed, as I said earlier, that the world we find ourselves in is just an amoral arena of accidentally existing organisms who just find themselves in a situation where they need to compete for survival, what would we expect to find? And what do we find? We find a system of natural selection which explains the origin of species on planet Earth, which is not, it doesn't just entail, but is based upon suffering and death. Survival of the fittest entails the death and destruction and suffering of the unfit. 99% plus of all the species who've ever existed on this planet have been brutally wiped from existence, even within the history of our own species. We've got all kinds of sufferings involved in its development throughout its history. Now, this kind of stuff is embedded into the very machinery by which God chose to create human beings. I'm not saying this can't be explained by Christianity. Of course, you could say that maybe this is all part of some grand plan. Maybe the suffering is compensated for in the afterlife. Maybe animals do go to heaven after all, and it just kind of makes up for all the suffering that they're forced to undergo. I'm not going to say this is impossible, but I'm going to ask you what you think is more plausibly the case if we assume either hypothesis. What would you expect to see? I don't think we'd expect to see anything like this if we assumed that there was a benevolent invigilator. But as I say, if we assume atheism, not only do we explain what we see in the world, but we also come to expect it. I think it's a much better account. This is the problem of evil. Now, there's another argument, or another consideration, which is sometimes thought of as a subset of the problem of evil, and that's the problem of divine hiddenness. If there is a God who is good and wants to come to know us, then why is he so hidden from so many of us, so much of the time, even from those who so desperately seek his attention? Of course, there are people who are what J.L. Schellenberg has called resistant non-believers. They don't believe in God, probably through something of their own fault. Maybe they're resisting in some sense. Maybe they're blinding themselves to the evidence. Maybe they're really unwilling to approach the question honestly. Maybe they don't want it to be true and wouldn't accept it even if it were true. Lots of people like this do exist, of course. But as long as there is one example of somebody who honestly seeks God, wants to enter into a relationship with God, and has refused it, there's a problem here. How can this be explained? Schellenberg formalizes the problem as saying, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving. If a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Non-resistant non-belief does occur. Therefore, it would follow that there is no God.
If you start from the idea that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving, then the reality of the world doesn't add up. Evolution isn't a clean or kind process. It's brutal. According to the journal Nature, over 99.9% of all species that have ever lived are extinct. Most died out through famine, disease, predation, or environmental collapse. And suffering isn't just a human condition. It's embedded in the biology of life. For example, parasites like Loa Loa, a worm that painfully burrows through the human eye, serve no moral or spiritual lesson. They exist because nature is indifferent, not because it's guided by love. The theological excuse that suffering builds character doesn't apply to animals who live and die in agony or children born with terminal illnesses. And if God wants a relationship with us, why is his presence less obvious than gravity or sunlight? Studies in cognitive science, like those by Justin Barrett, show religious belief may be an evolved byproduct of our pattern-seeking brains, not evidence of divine truth. In this light, atheism doesn't just explain the suffering, it explains why belief itself exists. Christianity starts with an answer and tries to fit the world into it. Atheism starts with the world as it is.
So the argument that you're running in, this divine hiddenness argument, why would God allow people to remain in error about his non-existence? Wouldn't we think that God would intervene? I think you're right that divine hiddenness is a subset, really, of the problem of evil. We could just call it the problem of bad stuff. Animal pain is bad, not believing in God is bad. Why would God let bad stuff exist? And my question for you, Alex, would be, I guess I'll run the argument this way and you can fill it in how you like, that if there are at least isolated cases where we see bad stuff, but we say, oh yeah, I understand why God would let that bad stuff happen, like minor moral evils between human beings that allow us to grow in virtue. Say, okay, I see why God would allow this kind of bad stuff. Here's the circle of bad stuff. I see why God would allow it. Then it seems like, well, we've got this other bad stuff. I don't see why God would allow it. But from my perspective, if God is all powerful and all knowing, here's this circle. He could have reasons. I mean, who am I to say he does not have reasons for this other stuff? And also, it's not just that I would say, who am I to say he does not have reasons? I can think of some plausible reasons. So one that comes for the issue of divine hiddenness, I'll give you a few things to chew on there. Number one, I think that God wants to keep an epistemic distance so that we have more freedom to be able to engage him and pursue certain kinds of goods, like sharing the existence of God with others. For example, when you see police lights behind you on a freeway, you slow down not out of goodness for the other drivers, but because you don't want to get caught. Now, I'm not saying this is the whole answer to divine hiddenness, but I think that God, he gives some space, number one. Number two, an answer to divine hiddenness might be related to the other problem of evil. Because you're saying, well, look, if someone has gone astray cognitively in that they failed to recognize God exists, why doesn't God step in and correct that if he loves them? A similar question is, when someone goes astray and acts immorally, why doesn't God step in and correct them? Well, he lets us have free will. If he gives us moral freedom, I also think he gives us cognitive freedom. And I think he gives us that cognitive freedom so much so that even things like giving everyone a feeling that he exists, giving that sign, I'm kind of skeptical that would be sufficient, because there are people, Alex, philosophers, frankly, you're one of them actually, who don't believe in the existence of things that I think are patently obvious. Free will, self-consciousness. There are philosophers who think they're eliminative materialists, so they don't think the conscious self really exists. And that seems totally obvious to be real. So I guess that's a thought I have on this negative case for God. And the way I would look at it, is to make it simple, is that, look, we have reasons to think God can allow some of these bad things. Who are we to say he does not have reasons for the other bad things? Here are some possible ones. And then there are marks of goodness in there that I still want some explanation of. So I guess that's how I would look at it a little bit.
Yeah, okay, so let's kind of take this in order. The first point is to say, there are some circumstances in which it seems, at least plausibly the case, that God would have good reason to allow suffering. That there are sort of maybe cases of small amounts of suffering, or cases where it's clearly beneficial in some way, it serves some higher order good. And if we're willing to accept that, God has good reason to inflict this form of suffering, or to permit this form of suffering, why not think that he has reason to permit more suffering or different kinds of suffering? I can answer this by analogy, maybe. A famous analogy that's often given in the context of a discussion that's quite helpful is to imagine a child at the dentist, and the child's too young. You can't explain to the child why they're undergoing the pain of the dentistry, but we all know that they're going through it because there's some better cause that's being served by it. Of course, if the parent was in a situation where they were able to prevent the child from needing to go through the dental operation in the first place, then forcing them to undergo it would make them quite cruel. I think that's more like the situation God is in. But I actually want to imagine that you see a parent who, and maybe you don't know anything about dentistry, maybe you're from an isolated tribe or something, and you see a parent kind of taking these sharp objects and digging into a child's mouth, and you think, oh, this looks pretty bad. Someone explains to you about dentistry, and you think, okay, right, so there's good reason for the parent to be inflicting this kind of suffering. Now, if we consider the kinds of suffering that we see across the natural world, we're not just talking about these kinds of cases of obvious benefit or menial suffering. We're talking about deep, intense, unimaginable suffering. So now imagine that you were walking along a road and you saw a parent just mercilessly beating up a child, just ripping the child limb from limb, just punching it, like contorting it out of shape. and you said this is terrible, this is disgusting, and we need to intervene. And I said to you, well, look, hold on a second. You accepted that a parent might have good reason to inflict suffering on their child if there's good justifiable reason. And if you're willing to accept it for these kinds of suffering, why wouldn't you accept it for this kind of suffering? It's at least plausible they have good reason. Maybe there is some kind of reason that we are just incapable of understanding about their relationship, where this is something that needs to be done and is morally justifiable. But I don't think it just follows from the fact that we can imagine some circumstances in which the infliction of suffering would be permitted by a good God, that we should just hypothesize that even if we see a great deal of apparently meaningless suffering, we should just conclude on the basis of that yeah, he probably has good reason for that too. I just don't think that follows.
Well, I think my reply to that would be, if I saw a parent engage in terrible abuse of a child, I have background knowledge to know what human parents are and are not capable of to contribute to the well-being of a child. And so a parent who is dismembering or eviscerating a child, I have sufficient background knowledge, given what human parents are, to know they cannot be contributing to the child's well-being. And also comparing it to a reference class, unfortunately well populated by parents who are abusive towards their children, and that this parent belongs to that reference class. But with God, however, if God exists, then I know that he is not limited in power or knowledge to bring about greater goods. He's not limited like a human parent in that regard. And then also, so the argument that you make, it is subject to a modus tollens, to a reversal. It's essentially saying, if gratuitous evils exist, God does not exist. Gratuitous evils exist, therefore God does not exist. But if God does exist, it just turns out the evils are only apparently gratuitous. And so that will come down to our position we're in. But I also think that God's ability, when we look at the world also, when we talk, I think this is also important to bring up when we talk about the world, right? Like when you look at the world, when I look at the world, what do we expect? The world, like right now, the world, it's like it's like a slice of what we're looking at. Like the world is this 4-dimensional block. Imagine the world is not just like right now. It's like the whole thing. And so under the Christian view, it's like there's a beginning of it, there's a trial period. The Catechism talks about it journeying to perfection. And then there is an unending, and this end of the block has no end. And it's reached perfection. So then we've discussed this before, and I apologize if it feels like we're going to tread ground we've already tread, but we have new people listening, which is good. One could ask the question, is it better if God exists, would it be the case he would only create a world we call perfect? Or would he create a world that journeys to perfection? And I would say a world that journeys to perfection would actually be somewhat expected, because it has more goods in it. It has the goods of perfection, and then the other goods that lead up to that, like goods you can only have that are associated with evils, like compassion, courage, forgiveness, things like that.
Trent says God might have hidden reasons for allowing evil and suffering. But that's not a valid explanation. It's just appealing to mystery to cover up contradictions. If God is all-powerful and all-loving, the existence of gratuitous suffering that serves no purpose, is incompatible with that claim. And we can prove gratuitous suffering exists. Take childhood bone cancer. It causes months of pain, often ends in death, and affects kids too young to grow in virtue. What purpose does that serve? Evolution by natural selection doesn't require purpose. It just explains this suffering as part of a blind, unguided process. According to pediatric cancer statistics from the American Cancer Society, around 10,000 children are diagnosed with cancer in the US every year, and many die. If a human let this happen with the power to stop it, we'd call them evil. But with God, we call it mysterious? Second, Trent compares cognitive freedom to moral freedom, but people don't choose to disbelieve. Studies in psychology, like those by Ara Norenzayan, show that belief in God is heavily influenced by cultural exposure and cognitive bias. If God wants a relationship with everyone, why is belief so geographically skewed? Why is the one true faith always what your parents believed? And finally, his claim that we should trust that God has good reasons because he's God is circular. He's assuming the conclusion to defend the problem. As Hitchens said, what can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
You said that you think that something like the Book of Job speaks to God's tenderness.
Oh, yes, about how God responds to evil and suffering.
Because my interpretation of the Book of Job is that God responds to Job asking, and Job's lucky in the sense that when he asks for a response, for an explanation for his suffering, at least God actually answers him.
Right.
But God doesn't say, hey, take heed, I'm here for you, chill out, it's all cool, I've got a plan for you. He says, who is this that darkeneth counsel?
Gird your loins, man.
Yeah.
Yes, but
for I will question you, and you will answer me, as if to say, who do you think you are to deserve an answer here? This doesn't seem very tender to me. This seems like God saying, not only am I going to inflict suffering upon you, and not only am I not going to give you an explanation as to why that suffering is taking place, but who the hell do you think you are to demand an explanation? Mm-hmm. This seems, and the tragic irony of the situation is that, of course, God is saying to Job, implying to Job, well, you can't understand your suffering. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? You'll never get this. But the irony is that the reason for Job's suffering is explained to the reader of the book of Job. Right? The author of the book of Job explains to the reader why it is that Job is suffering. He gives the story of why God is inflicting the suffering, and yet the moral of the story is supposed to be, well, Job is suffering, and he could never understand. He could never be in a position to understand. Well, we are, as a reader, it's explained to us in the book, but we're supposed to believe that Job couldn't have understood.
But what happens to
and
Job
and that anger is well, in the end of Job is compensated. He's given like a new wife, as if that's just going to make up for the fact that his old one died. No, again, it's this idea that you can just kind of, he's like, well, he repents in dust and ashes, and then his life is restored, and he lives, a long and happy life. What are we supposed to take from this? A man who gets has all kinds of sufferings inflicted upon him, has these moments of thinking that God isn't what he thought he was. He says, God, how could you do this? God answers him and says, who the hell do you think you are? Job goes, sorry, yeah, you're right, I'm sorry. And then he's all fine again. Where's the tenderness? Where's the compassion? Where's the kind of New Testament readying essence of Job that you were talking about?
Right, well, there's always going to be a balance between, now God could just say, who are you? I can do whatever I want, and then leave him in the ashes. So there's a balance between God in compensating Job and giving him more than what he lost. So giving him more crops, more cattle. Though interestingly,
a better wife, maybe.
No, interestingly enough, the same number of children, because the Bible understands that children are not like property that you can compensate by just giving more of something. That I always thought was an interesting note in the end of the story there, that God brings Job out of this, but at the same time recognizing, and this is hard for us in the modern age where we have no problem speaking to the manager when we're upset about something. That was not a trait in human beings for a long time, of recognizing God's majesty and sovereignty. It's a balancing act that we can go too far and say God is so tender, he doesn't really care about having authority and being just and punishing wrongdoing. And then the other extreme is God is so sovereign, I don't care, I can stomp around because I'm the king. I do believe a right Christian theology can find a balance between the two.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I would just add that I wouldn't mind if I was asking God, why is this suffering, including why you're not revealing
and it's
yourself
important.
to me. If he just screamed at me, if he just said, well, who the hell are you? I probably would be like, right, oh, there you are. Okay, I'm sorry, man. Like, I guess I do just repent in dust and ashes and become a Christian.
Are you sure? Really? Really?
Yeah.
Have you just heard a voice? Given your background knowledge, are you aware of many people who think they hear God, but they don't?
Yes.
How do you know you're not one of them?
Well, I wasn't even making a claim there as to what I like kind of ought to do. I'm just saying I think I would actually do that.
Okay.
I think I kind of wouldn't have a problem with that. My criticism there was just of you describing God as kind of being tender.
And also it's important when we look at like the biblical witness.
The book of Job is often cited to show God's wisdom or justice. But under scrutiny, it exposes a deeply flawed moral framework. Job's suffering wasn't punishment or the result of free will. It was collateral damage in a wager between God and Satan. That's not divine love. That's cosmic cruelty. And the idea that Job is eventually compensated with new children misses the point. Psychological studies, including work published in The Lancet Psychiatry, show that the loss of a child causes trauma that no material restoration can erase. Children aren't livestock. Replacing them doesn't erase grief. Then there's the issue of God's response to Job. Where were you when I created the earth? This isn't an explanation. It's a power move. It's the kind of reasoning you'd expect from a dictator, not a moral exemplar. In modern ethics, the burden of justification lies with the one causing harm, not the one suffering. But the Bible reverses this. It asks the victim to justify their pain. Worse, this authoritarian tone is repeated across Scripture. In 1 Samuel 15, God commands genocide. In Deuteronomy 21, rebellious children are to be stoned. These aren't metaphors. They're moral codes of an Iron Age tribe, not universal principles. And when Christians appeal to the whole picture of Scripture, citing verses like 1 Peter 5:7 about casting your anxiety on God, it doesn't erase the abuse elsewhere. If a text has to be selectively read and the violence constantly reinterpreted, it's not divine. It's propaganda. From a psychological standpoint, the desire to find meaning in suffering is deeply human. Viktor Frankl wrote about this in Man's Search for Meaning. But recognizing suffering and assigning it a reason are not the same. Religion hijacks this instinct, offering answers that comfort rather than confront reality. The atheist explanation is simpler and more honest. Suffering exists because nature is indifferent, not intentional. The evolutionary process has no goal, no morality. It just selects what survives. This view doesn't make suffering easier, but it makes it comprehensible. We don't need to invent a cruel God to explain pain. We just need to accept reality.
The entire picture about it has to be looked at in a whole.
Yes.
So, I mean, some episodes or passages of Scripture will reveal some aspects of God. For example, the Old Testament authors were extremely concerned about defending God's sovereignty, because they'll say, well, look, you think your God is so great. He lets this bad thing happen. He lets Pharaoh enslave you. And the Old Testament author is saying, no, our God, Yahweh, he is the God of gods. He is sovereign over everything. And so they're really emphasizing that. Whereas then in maybe other aspects of the Bible, we read like in 1 Peter, we cast all our anxieties upon him. We have to look at the whole picture. But
Christianity asks us to believe that genocide, silence, suffering, and randomness are all part of a plan. But the evidence shows a chaotic, amoral universe where humans are left to find meaning on their own. That's not a failure of faith. That's a sign of intellectual honesty. Question and call to action. If a God existed and truly loved us, would the world look like this? Or are we better off taking responsibility for each other without waiting on invisible voices? Let us know what you think in the comments.
Evil does exist, as much as that may be a problem for why a loving God would allow evil. Nonetheless, it's a signpost that something beyond the material world has to exist to allow this realm of good and evil to exist. In fact,
I think Alex recognizes that signpost because on his website, he rails, I think rightfully, against some of the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church, where he talks about how priests have sexually abused children, and obviously that's a great wrong. But my question is, Alex, if you really think that is a great wrong, why would you deny objective morality? I mean, is that really wrong, or is it just a matter of personal opinion?
Well, I think that we agree in one sense that evil doesn't necessarily disprove God. I'm with you on that. What I would say is to answer your question, objectively, no. It is a subjective thing. Morality, to me, is entirely subjective.
Why do you say that?
Well, because, firstly, a thing to note is that objective morality... Well, let's talk about what objective actually means, I suppose. Objectivity, to me, if you want my definition, would be to say that it is true regardless of human intervention, regardless of human consciousness. For instance, the Earth orbits the Sun. That would be true if all humans disappeared. Right. Every single one of them. It would still be an objective fact. But to say that murder is wrong, if every human disappeared, that couldn't still be wrong, surely. That wouldn't that would be a nonsense concept without some kind of human psychology. The only way that you could argue that perhaps it would still be wrong is if there was some kind of transcendent being. But then you need to have that being in order to prove the existence of the objective morality that you're then using to prove the God. So
what we're doing is we're reasoning from effect to cause, that we have this effect known as this moral law that is pressing on us. And as you admitted in the video, and look, videos, 2-minute videos, 10-minute videos, you can't expound on all the nuances. So if this is wrong, correct me. But you seem to say that we, in fact, I think you quoted, the quote was, let me just quote you accurately on this, because in the video you said this, you said moral truths are so deeply ingrained in us that they feel like they are objective.
Yes.
Right? Okay, so my question is, why would you doubt they're objective if they're so deeply ingrained in us?
Well, because this is where I think Sam Harris is right, in the sense that if you have certain assumptions, so let's say that we could assume that human well-being was a good thing. We'll discuss why shortly, but let's say we assume that. We could then say that it is objectively true that we should act in certain ways, for instance, trying not to murder people. And that would then become an objective morality.
Right.
So because evolution has instilled within us, through genetics, a drive to stay alive, then we can derive objective moral truths about how we should act in order that complies with this inner nature, which I think has come about through evolution. So even if you don't subscribe to the idea that certain moral actions, such as not killing or not stealing, have come about through evolution, the instinctual nature within us to stay alive causes us to think of those as objective truths. But it's a technicality. So for all intents and purposes, you could say they're objective truths. If you grab 100 people off the street and ask them, is rape wrong? 100 of them will say yes. But that doesn't mean it's objective. I mean, for instance, I put it to you, would you say that chocolate is tasty?
Yeah, I would, but that's a subjective.
Right, sure.
Some people may not like chocolate.
It's subjective.
Yeah.
So
that's
tar,
a flavor.
So tar can be just as tasty as chocolate. But that's no problem, right? That's no problem whatsoever. So when you say something along the lines of, so morality is subjective. So what Hitler did being wrong was just an opinion. Well, yes, but in the same sense that chocolate tasting as good as tar is an opinion.
I think when
it doesn't make a difference.
Alex is right to say morality can be subjective and still meaningful. We don't need a God to recognize that rape, murder, or child abuse are wrong, because we understand harm, suffering, and empathy directly as human beings. That's not a weakness in morality. It's how moral reasoning actually works. Research in evolutionary psychology shows that our sense of right and wrong developed to help humans cooperate and survive. Empathy, fairness, and reciprocity are traits seen not just in humans but in primates, elephants, even rats. These aren't divine instructions. They're natural. Social instincts shaped over millions of years. Moral philosopher Philippa Foot showed that moral claims are grounded in human needs and natural facts, not commands from above. When we say something is wrong, we're pointing to real-world harm, not breaking a supernatural rule. Frank's claim that moral disagreement means morality must be objective misunderstands how moral systems develop. Disagreement doesn't mean there's no truth. It means we're still working to understand it, like any area of knowledge. Let's hear Frank Turek's response.
Well, no, I think it does, because it's much more obvious that, say, sexually abusing children is wrong than atheism's true.
Right.
So why would you say that atheism's true in order to avoid the obvious conclusion that sexually abusing children is wrong? You already know sexually abusing children is wrong. Now, if you want to use an evolutionary argument, the problem is that undercuts everything you think. Because if everything we think is the product of evolution, the product of the laws of physics or biology or whatever it is, then why should we believe anything we think? Forget about morality for a second. Why should we even believe that atheism's true or that Christianity's true? If we're completely... I'm sorry, I'm suffering from jet lag here. If our thoughts are the result of some random evolutionary process, why should we believe anything we think is true?
Well, the first thing is that evolution isn't a random process. But that aside,
let me put it this way. It's either directed by an outside intelligence or it's not.
Sure, okay, I'll give
If
you
it's not directed by an outside intelligence, then it's random.
Yes, so?
So if it's directed by intelligence, then perhaps God exists. If it's not directed by intelligence, why should we believe anything we think?
It's this idea, it's almost sort of existential. Why should we believe anything if there's no guidance? To me, it's like asking the question, like you said earlier, about how do we know that we even exist, or that the universe wasn't created last Thursday. For me, it's somewhat based on consensus. It doesn't prove it's true, but reason is one of those things that we need to assume in order to get anywhere. In the same sense, we need to assume that we exist in order to have a philosophical discussion.
No, that's a very wise point. I agree with you. The question is, how do we explain reason on a naturalistic worldview?
Well, reason and consciousness can be explained as coming about through evolution. The way in which we sense the world.
But let's stop there for just a second, though, Alex. If that's the case, why should we trust it?
Oh, well, we don't necessarily have to. Again, it's a subjective thing. But every single person...
But that would mean reason's subjective.
Yes, well, it is.
Well, if reason is subjective, then...
If reason's not subjective, then how do you and I come to different conclusions, both using reason?
Because we have free will. If reason's subjective, we couldn't even communicate. If there weren't these objective, unchanging laws of logic...
well, yes, there are objective rules and tenets of reason, but reason itself is subjective in the same way that morality, you can say, under certain assumptions, there are objective truths about morality. If you have a certain assumption about reason, then yes, there are objective tenets.
Well, that's what I mean. These immaterial laws of logic that aren't made of molecules, how do we explain those on a naturalistic worldview?
How do you mean? How do we explain?
Why are there laws of logic? Why are there laws of mathematics?
They're a product of consciousness. And laws of mathematics are not a thing in themselves, but rather a way to explain the universe. So the laws of mathematics would not exist without human beings, so they are subjective. But the things that they describe would.
Oh, no, hold on.
So when you talk about logic, when you talk about reason, these things aren't ends, they're means. They're means to understanding certain things. So we use reason to understand that the Earth goes around the sun.
Frank tries to argue that if our minds are the product of evolution, then we can't trust reason or moral beliefs. But this misunderstands how evolution works. Natural selection favors organisms that accurately perceive and respond to their environment, because those that don't, die. The fact that we can land spacecraft on other planets, predict disease patterns, and build the internet is strong evidence that our evolved brains are reliably processing information. Reason isn't some magical gift that requires a divine source. It's a tool, a cognitive strategy that evolved because it helped our species survive. Neuroscience confirms this. Our brains are built to detect patterns, solve problems, and simulate future outcomes. These abilities enhanced our fitness in the ancestral environment. As for logic and math, those aren't floating laws that exist outside time and space. They're descriptive systems we created to understand consistent patterns in nature. The Pythagorean theorem works not because it was written in the sky by a god, but because we observed relationships in geometry that are always true under certain conditions. Alex is right to say that these tools, reason, logic, math, are means, not ends. They help us model reality. We assume their usefulness because they work. No faith in the supernatural is required.
I like what Louise Antony said in her debate with William Lane Craig. Louise Antony is an atheist, but she admitted something about morality and atheism that I think is very insightful. Here's what she said. This is her quote. She said, "Any argument for moral skepticism will be based upon premises which are less obvious than the existence of objective moral values themselves." And here she is as an atheist saying, I have this sense of moral obligation that is so strong that any argument you give me for atheism or moral subjectivism will be based on the weaker premises than just the sense that I have that objective moral values and obligations exist. So that was my question originally to you, Alex, is why would you deny the strongest belief that you have intuitively and adopt a weaker belief in atheism or agnosticism?
Well, I don't deny it, because I don't deny, like I say, as long as I do have certain assumptions, and I admit that there are assumptions, I can say that I have an objective sense that these things are wrong on the assumption that I'm aiming for human prosperity.
Right, but you already pointed out that Sam Harris is begging the question on that. That is his human flourishing. And that's a conflation of epistemology and ontology. And as you pointed out, rightfully so, and 18 years old, he's already figured this out, which I didn't know this is 18, that Sam Harris is confusing epistemology and ontology. He's assuming what he's trying to prove.
But the problem with Sam Harris's argument is he's going in there trying to show that certain things are right or wrong based on science. What I'm trying to do is say why people experience things as right or wrong based on science, which can be done. So I can say the reason that I feel that this is right and wrong is because of this. What I can't say is that this is right or wrong because of this.
I mean, does this mean, is it a problem for you then, telling people what they ought to do? Because there's a sense in which, you know, if you see a society being racist or treating women unequally or whatever it might
or
be.
Or Catholic priests abusing children like you do on your website, you say that's wrong?
For me, the problem has always been, for the atheist who denies objective morality, is what right do you have to tell someone else? Because they're just acting according to their subjective preferences.
Well, the subjective preferences, I find, in these cases, we often agree. So, for instance, if I meet a member of the Ku Klux Klan, we can find common ground in the sense that I might say, okay, so why is this wrong? Why is that wrong? Why? Until we get to the final point and they say, well, I think that it's because my worldview is better for humanity. And I say, well, hang on, so do I. I think my worldview is better for humanity. So let's go on the assumption that what we want is to get what's best for humanity. And here's how I think my worldview leads to that. So even people...
but if they say, but I don't believe black people are human... What do you say to that?
Well, that's the thing. Then the discussion doesn't then the discussion becomes trying to prove how they are.
Right.
You sort of remove the need for a basis once you find out what the basis of their beliefs are. Once you find that common ground. For instance, me and you agree. You and I agree that, for instance, I assume that we would agree that human flourishing is a good thing.
Oh, sure.
But you would say that that's because you have that in you because of God. I say that I have that in me because of evolution.
It's not just because it's in me, but because there's an objective standard of goodness outside of ourselves.
Absolutely
and
fine.
So when you say that we can agree that we want to have a better society, as Justin pointed out earlier, you're implying a best. Because in order to say something's better or worse, you have to imply a best. Well, what is that best? What is the ontological grounding of that best?
Not necessarily. You don't have to have... this reminds me of one of Thomas Aquinas' famous 5 ways, the degrees of perfection. There doesn't need to be an absolute perfection to have an idea of something which is more perfect than something else. And to your reference of C.S. Lewis...
I think there would have to be a standard of perfection or a standard that you're aiming for to say you're getting closer to that standard or further away, better or worse.
It's like your reference to C.S. Lewis. You can't know a crooked line without having some idea of straight. I don't think that's true. For instance, think of it this way.
Why is it not true?
It's not a case, if you're talking about good and evil, you don't need evil to know good. If you think about, say you have a flat plane.
You're absolutely right about that.
Think about you have a flat plane.
You don't need evil to know good, I agree with you.
So,
you need good to know evil, though.
I don't think so either. If you have a flat plane, you can see like a hill, like an indentation on that flat plane. Now, the rest of that plane is not a valley. You don't need the valley to understand the hill. You just need the hill in comparison to what is neutral. So you can have evil compared to what is neutral. You can have good compared to what is neutral. You don't need the two extremes.
What would be your definition of evil?
My definition of evil? Well, that's a very broad thing. But if you're asking me, again, subjectively, anything, I would say, that unwarrantedly elicits human suffering or animal suffering to an extent.
Okay,
as well.
so that would imply that it's the opposite of human flourishing. So it's very difficult to define evil without reference to good.
Not necessarily. It's not. It may be the opposite of human flourishing, but it's also just the absence of no suffering. Not necessarily good, but no evil. In the same sense, this is what frustrates me about atheists a lot, is they'll do the same thing but the opposite. They'll look at God and they'll think of the evil. They'll listen to Hitchens talk about some celestial North Korea and they'll recoil at that and they'll say, that's a horrible thing. I can't imagine that reality. But I'm sorry, just because you don't like a reality doesn't make it not real. And so if there are if there are no objective morals, then unfortunately what Joseph Stalin did in the USSR was not objectively wrong. But that's not a shocking thing to say if we're under the assumption that nothing is objectively wrong.
Do you understand then why for many people the moral argument is so powerful?
Absolutely.
Because they cannot get themselves to a point of view where those kinds of acts are only really about people's
But
preferences.
I don't think that's what Frank is necessarily doing, because I think you're right that a lot of people do just recoil in horror at the idea of there being no objective standard, but I don't think that's what you're doing. I'd say that you're being cleverer than that. You're understanding that, yes, this is a bad idea, but more than that, you're saying that there's some way to prove that there is an objective reality,
right.
not just because you don't like it.
Yeah, I want to get beyond that, or maybe I should say underneath that, going back to Justin's point, and it's this. If you said this is all the result of evolution, you have to get outside the evolutionary process to believe that thought is true. Because if that thought is a result of the evolutionary process as well, why believe it?
Frank appeals to emotion when he says that without objective morality, we can't call things like Stalin's atrocities truly wrong. But this only proves that people feel moral convictions deeply. It doesn't prove they're grounded in something supernatural. Alex is right to point out that we can talk about better and worse actions based on their consequences, specifically how they affect well-being and reduce suffering. That's not arbitrary. It's measurable. If a society promotes human flourishing, reduces cruelty, and improves life for the most people, that's a clear moral improvement, even without invoking a divine standard. Philosophers like Derek Parfit and Peter Singer have shown that you don't need a god to get to universal ethics. You just need reason, empathy, and a commitment to consistency. Most people already agree on basic moral values because we're wired for empathy and shaped by social norms. And when we disagree, we use reason and evidence to argue for better outcomes, not scripture. Christianity doesn't own morality. In fact, some of the Bible's moral teachings, like support for slavery, genocide, and patriarchy, are now considered deeply wrong because our understanding of morality has evolved. So Alex is right. Morality is not about divine rules. It's about how we treat each other in the real world. What do you think makes a society truly moral? Dogma or compassion? If you found this valuable, like the video, subscribe, and join us for more honest conversations that put reason first.